All right, let's talk through this.
I've had this Quince Co Lark in my stash for about a year now. I was originally planning on using it for a cabled sweater, but the more I looked at it, the more the color wasn't quite right on its own. It's just a little bit too light somehow. I tend to like a browner pink, so I am holding this together with some Knitting for Olive Silk Mohair in the Plum Clay colorway. And I'm really happy with the color I'm getting with the two yarns held together in the swatch. The Quince Co yarn is a 4-ply and it's very round, so I'm getting great stitch definition in the swatch even with that yarn being held together with the silk mohair. This brand of silk mohair feels nice. It's not quite as soft as something like the Shibui silk mohair if you're familiar with that, but Knitting for Olive has a color palette that's way more to my preference. The colors they have available are really subtle and they have a variety of pinks and neutrals, which is sort of my thing. I used the recommended needle size to swatch, which was a US 8 5.0 millimeter, and I wet blocked the swatch since that's what I'm planning to do with the finished garment. The honeycomb brioche stitch pattern is so stretchy that I could have made the gauge say pretty much whatever I wanted. So after it was wet blocked and I had squeezed the water out with a towel, I just laid it on my blocking board and sort of patted it out. I didn't pin it or anything, and I was getting close to the recommended gauge, so I figured I would just go with it. I also didn't find the honeycomb brioche to be super intuitive, so in the pattern the designer suggests that you start with the back panel if you just want to get some practice with that brioche stitch. So I think that is what I'm going to do, just so I'm not worried about like the additional cabling going on the front panel. Let's get started! Okay, this is flying. So here are a few repeats of the main stitch pattern on the back panel. One thing to keep in mind if you're knitting this pattern is that there is a selvage stitch on each side that doesn't count in the stitch repeat. So this was confusing me at first, and so I decided to put markers at the selvages, and that helped a lot. So just after, like, there would be a marker and then there'd be one stitch on the outside of it, that's the selvage stitch, and that sort of got me over my hump with understanding how the brioche pattern was formed. The instructional videos provided in the pattern are really good. I couldn't quite visualize this as written because with the way the designer charts this, you don't have the typical double stitch on the needle that you see in brioche. The structure of the stitch pattern ends up being really clear after you do a few repeats, and it's actually really simple. All right, here is the back. I'm almost done. I have finished the shoulder shaping. You can see that there's just a little bit of binding off at the neckline and shoulder shaping to make the neck slope gradually, which is nice. You can see the difference between the gauge in the stockinette section versus the brioche section. I think that is both what gives the eventual sweater its shape, and also it's just sort of interesting. I hope this blocks out enough to make this not be baggy. I think that it will. The coolest part of all this is this braid and how it is formed. I really don't want to give it away because I think this is a good enough reason to buy the pattern just on its own, honestly. You could put this braid on a whole lot of different things, but basically this column of what looks like two janky knit stitches eventually ends up turning into this, and it is super easy to do. The second braid is done. The only other thing I forgot to mention, I wouldn't exactly call this a modification because the designer mentions that you can do it in the pattern, but I have these stitches on hold for both shoulders because eventually I'm going to be doing a 3-needle bind off instead of seaming at the shoulders, just since that is easier. I'm using the German twisted cast on for all of these pieces since a stretchy cast on is recommended. Seeing the cable and bobble pattern start to emerge on the front panel was so cool. I'm really happy with the yarn combo here. This dark mohair with the lighter main color is really making all of these textures pop. I really liked how the bobbles were written in the pattern, but they weren't that noticeable against the background, and I really wanted them to stand out. So I ended up using a trick that seems sort of weird but really makes bobbles pop. I left a few of the bobbles as written so you can really see the difference here on the right side. The technique I used, if you can call it that, is to use my needle to pull up the loose stitch to the right of the bobble, give it a twist with my fingers, and then loop that strand around the bobble like a necklace. After that strand is looped around, all it takes is a little bit of manhandling of the bobble to really get them to look nice and stand out against that background. The front panel seemed to go really quickly, and I was almost sad when it was over. I knit this to pattern measurements, but when I looked at the sample in the pattern photos, it looks like there may have been one additional repeat of the big cable in the original pattern. I really wanted to make sure that the last cable cross was in a nice place, like not too close or too far away from where the neckline ended up, so I think I'm happy with this. I wet blocked this as usual. I know some people don't like to wet block mohair, but I don't have a problem with it. It does come out of the bath looking like a wet cat, but once it dries, the mohair fluffs up again and it's back to normal. Neither of these yarns are superwash, so I don't expect this to stretch out of shape due to that, but the pieces are so big that I'm still being really careful as I get them out of the bath. The weight of the water could easily stretch these pieces too much. Since there would be seaming involved here and the pieces were oddly shaped, I made sure to block this to measurements. If I have room on my blocking mats, I like to orient the pieces with shoulder edges together so that I can visually make sure that those areas are blocked at least close to the same width. Happily, you can see that the weird reverse stockinette bubble on the back piece did end up blocking out just fine. When I placed my blocking pins for this, I put them between the rib and the body so it wouldn't pull the curve of the hem into any points. The sleeves are worked in the round, so you also learn how to work the honeycomb brioche in the round for this part of the project. For this ribbing, I decided to work Eastern pearls through the back loop. So this doesn't twist the pearl stitches like the method I used on my good sweater, but the Eastern pearls use just a bit less yarn and keep the rib looking more pulled in. So I'll demonstrate the English way first. And here's the same thing, but with continental style with the yarn in my left hand. I regularly use both styles for different reasons or different stitch patterns, but generally for all ribbing, I usually hold my yarn in my left hand. I'm about 3/4 of the way done with the first sleeve according to the pattern, so I just wanted to lay it out next to my body pieces to see how everything is going to fit together. The pattern has you sew the shoulder seams and a length of the side seams first and then sew the sleeve into the holes. Since drop sleeves are sometimes tricky to fit on my body, I decided to stop the sleeve for a moment and do the 3-needle bind off for the shoulders. So you can see how this is fitting on me currently, and this is exactly why I wanted to try this on. So a couple of my fit issues are that I have really broad shoulders for my bust size, and I also have short arms. So ordinarily I have to shorten sleeve lengths on sweaters, but for a drop shoulder, what usually ends up happening is exactly what's happening right now, which is for my bust size, the drop is not going to be as long on me because it has to go over my broad shoulders. So with a drop shoulder, I might end up actually having to lengthen the sleeves, which is pretty much foreign to me. I never have to do that for any other sweaters. But so I'm approximately the same size as the designer. She's modeling her own pattern in the pattern photo. And what you can see on her is that the drop shoulder comes down to about here. And so what I am likely going to have to do is actually lengthen the sleeve to sort of cover that gap. So according to how the pattern is written, this sleeve is about 3/4 of the way done. But as you can see, this is just not anywhere close to, if I were to knit the entire length of the sleeve, it's going to end up coming to about here. So I'll probably just continue to do my increases as written in the pattern, and then once I get to the stitch count to go around the widest part of my arm, I'll just knit straight until I get to where I need the length to be for the drop shoulder. Okay, second try on. I think the sleeve's about done. Yes, that looks like a good length. Yeah, I like it. Okay, so I'm going to try to not block this out too much, then I'll sew everything together. When picking up stitches for the neckband, I did my usual process of dividing the neckline in 4 sections using locking stitch markers so that I'm working with smaller sections when it comes to picking up the correct number of stitches. For this one, I'm going to start the beginning of round at a shoulder seam. This neckband, so I picked stitches up for the neckband, picked up the recommended number of stitches, and just the way that the stitch pattern has fallen, it looks like this cable here is continuing up into 2 of the knit stitches of the rib, and this one isn't, and I think that is going to bother me. The designer's photo of the pattern also has this going on, and now that I am looking at it, that's like all that I can see. It's hard to tell if this is one of those things that is only going to bother me right now while I'm working on it, or if it's going to bother me forever. But I think just to be safe, I'm going to rip this neckband out and pick up the stitches again and just shift the rib over 1 stitch so that the 2 columns of knit stitches are happening right in the middle of this center front cable. And I will be happier about that long term, probably. Now that all of the pieces are blocked, it's time to lay everything out and see how they fit together. Instead of measuring the side seam here, I just decided to lay the flat sleeve out and eyeball the appropriate length for the side seam. I pinned the front and back pieces together with a locking stitch marker so I would know how far I needed to seam. To cut down on some of the bulk at the seams, I decided to use a double strand of the mohair instead of the mohair plus worsted. With the ease of the garment, I'm not worried about the side seam or armhole seams receiving a lot of strain during wear, and the 2 strands of mohair seemed pretty strong regardless. I started seaming using mattress stitch as recommended. I made sure to stop relatively often to pull the seam stitches tight since the mohair wanted to stick to itself if I went too far. The selvage stitches really make the seaming a lot easier in the brioche section. For sewing in the sleeves, I'm again using my trusty stitch markers to pin the sleeve in place before sewing. The honeycomb brioche in the round leaves what looks like a seam at the beginning of round, so I want to make sure that that seam matches up with the side seam. Now that my sleeve was pinned in place, it's time to start sewing again with a double strand of mohair. Seaming a vertically knitted piece to a horizontal piece is always a bit of a fudge, but that's okay. I mattress stitched as best I could and just tried to be consistent with which parts of the stitches I was picking up on either side. As I'm getting closer to the beginning of the armhole seam, I'm stopping more frequently to make sure I'm picking up a good ratio of stitches from each piece. You really don't want one side bunching up if you have to ease a bunch of stitches in at the end of the round. This seam would have been a lot more bulky if I had chosen to use the worsted weight yarn, so I'm glad that I ended up going with the double strand of mohair. So the Favo sweater is done. I am really happy with how this turned out, although I will say that it is extremely cropped. For me, that's okay. I'm 5'2", I have no chest whatsoever, and I tend to like to wear things cropped. So I have this styled right now over a pair of Winslow culottes that I hacked into like a fisherman's pant. And as you can see from the other video, this sweater is not even meeting the top of these pants, and I have these hiked up above my natural waist. So I would say that this is probably a good sweater to wear on top of a long dress or something like that. Otherwise, unless you lengthen it, your shirt underneath is probably gonna show. I really like the folded neckline to finish this off. It's a nice touch, and it also creates like a really soft edge against the neck, which I appreciate. I'm definitely glad that I went back and redid the neckline so that this would line up with the center of the center front cable. I think that would have irritated me if I had just let it go. All in all, the pattern was really well written. I liked the video tutorials for the sort of unusual parts like the braids, which were really fun to make. I really liked that. And I had never done honeycomb brioche before, so that was also a fun new thing. I really like the combination that I chose of a light mane yarn and a darker mohair. I find that that gives really good stitch definition to both the cable patterns and the honeycomb brioche. And I like that the stitches all stand out because this was a relatively labor-intensive sweater. I would not consider this to be like a super easy TV knit until you have learned all the stitch patterns. But by the time you've learned the whole stitch pattern, the body is so short that you're basically done with it. So I can also really recommend starting with the back piece so that you can get a hang of the honeycomb brioche before starting the front and also having to deal with the cable panel at the same time. So I think that's everything I have to say about the Favo. I really enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to getting on to the next sweater.